Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. What a week. I've been in Sydney, Australia this week, and trust me, it's one of the best time zones to watch the US election. And I was very glad to be not on London time trying to stay awake, or worse, sleep through such a monumental result this week. So to digest what the resurrection of Donald Trump means for the United States, her allies, Ukraine, AUKUS, the Quad, the Indo-Pacific, I sat down with Michael Green, who heads the United States Study Centre in Sydney, where he's been the last 2 years. Before that, he was at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies Centre in DC and served on George W. Bush's National Security Council between 2001 and 2005. He's actually an extra special guest for this podcast because he specialises in Japanese security and national affairs, having authored several books on Indo-Pacific security from the Japanese perspective. I began by asking Dr. Michael Green if he expected Donald Trump's win.
I didn't expect it, but it's not surprising, if you know what I mean. It was always going to be close. It turned out to be a sweep for Donald Trump. The popular vote, the electoral college, all the swing states, the Senate, and probably at the time we're talking, it looks like the House of Representatives. So it's the biggest electoral victory in some time in the United States. But when you look at the total vote count, it's still a pretty closely divided country, and under different circumstances could have gone the other way. I think that the Harris campaign misunderstood how the Democratic Party had been just become disconnected from Americans in small towns, and how pulling out Taylor Swift or Beyonce was actually less compelling than Donald Trump pulling out Elon Musk. Because Americans love Taylor Swift and Beyonce, but Elon Musk has money and makes money. And this was an election about the economy. And people wondering, why are you still doing nothing about the fact that I paid $9 American for a gallon of milk still? And then the border was a huge factor. And if the Democrats were really paying attention, they would have done something about the border to cauterize that problem, but they didn't. So they were probably a bit shocked at how disconnected they had become from traditionally Democratic constituencies. You know, Trump made the most significant gains among blacks, Hispanics, younger voters, and union voters than any Republican since Ronald Reagan, and any Republican ever since Lincoln in some of these cases. So the Democrats misread their own base pretty badly.
Interestingly, I live in the UK. That's a pretty similar situation we saw to what Boris Johnson called the realignment. And I noticed Donald Trump used that word last night. Do you think that realignment is here to stay in America?
No. I think that the inflation, cost of living, and general world chaos factors are poison for any incumbent. The Japanese government, which we might talk about, the ruling LDP lost its majority, not expected, pretty catastrophic politically. Macron in France, Trudeau is doomed in Canada, and I think Albanese is in big trouble in Australia. So this is not just the US, this is a global issue for democracies having elections this year. But in 4 years, the dynamics could be different. The Democrats should be able to, or could be able to, claw back the support they lost among African Americans, Hispanics, younger voters, union voters. The big loss was among men. And the gap between men who have no college education and women who have college education was massive. Almost 50 points difference. College-educated women supporting Harris, men without college education supporting Trump. If you think about it, those men are not just misogynistic, or they are in a bad place as the economy shifts towards AI and a different dynamic. And they didn't see the government doing anything to help them. And there's no reason why Democrats can't, the way Bill Clinton did, recalibrate. They might not, but the country's polarized, but the exact makeup of the two sides is flexible enough that this doesn't have to be permanent if Democrats are smart about it.
Do you think that gender and race were drawbacks that ultimately cost Kamala Harris, or do you think it was really bread and butter issues that cost
I think it was
her?
bread and butter issues. I'm not saying there's no misogyny in politics. There are studies that show that globally in democracies, women are retreating from elected office because of misogyny, because of abuse, because of, in some countries, violent threats. So this is a global problem, no doubt about it. And in this election, there may have been some of that. But what might cause you to pause and think a little bit more about how much that was a factor are two things. First of all, she did much better than Joe Biden, the white guy. Biden was way under Trump in the polls compared to where Harris ended up. And then the other factor is there were Senate races. The Republicans won the Senate, but where there was a race in the U.S. Senate between a man and a woman, regardless of party, the woman won in every race but one. So it's a bit more mixed, and gender was a huge gap this election. Race is more complicated. You know, Trump did better with African Americans and Hispanics than Republicans have in a generation at least. So if this was a racist election, that doesn't quite add up. So I think, yes, all those things are in it. So witch's brew, the border, culture wars, DEI, all that stuff. But I think just like the Japanese election, just like the French election, the New Zealand election, the coming Canadian election, and Australia, as James Carville, Clinton's advisor, said, it's the economy, stupid.
Okay, a couple of things on the politics before we move on to what this all means for the world. Where did the Democrats go here? Who's most to blame out of these three? The Democratic Party, Joe Biden, or Kamala Harris for the scale of this loss? And you spoke before about Trump potentially having control of the House as well as the Senate. That gives him the Supreme Court and the Oval Office. Is this uncharted and very dangerous territory for America?
Let me start with the second one. The control of the Senate means Donald Trump will have a lot of influence over the Supreme Court, where there are only three left of center, if you will. So the court will become more conservative for a long time. And a lot of people aren't happy about that. But the fact that the Republicans control the House and the Senate does not give Donald Trump a blank check. There is not a single Republican Party. And a lot of the press saying Donald Trump has, created this army of orcs out of the Republican Party is wrong. They can't get elected in most cases in their own primaries against other Republicans if they're not supporting Trump. But privately, I figure, knowing a lot of them, 2/3 or 3/4 of the Republicans in the Senate are more in a Ronald Reagan mold than a Donald Trump mold. In polls, only 1/3 of voters who are Republicans say they are MAGA, Make America Great Again. And so within the Republican Party, there are also checks and balances on Trump. It's just you don't see them because there's no gain for a senator from the Midwest to publicly oppose Donald Trump. None. But quietly, when he was president last time, it was mainly Republicans in the Congress who checked and balanced him. And they smiled and they praised his, policies, and then they quietly put in place things to prevent his excesses. A good example I point to is when Donald Trump started musing in 2017 and 18 about pulling U.S. troops out of Korea and NATO, the Congress, which controls the budget, introduced amendments saying the president cannot use any of these funds to pull troops out of Korea or NATO without congressional approval. That was not done by Democrats. It was done by some of Trump's closest allies who are Republicans. So you don't see it because you don't want to publicly cross Donald Trump if you're a Republican. But privately, there's a lot of these moves. And within his own administration, there will be, as there was last time, a lot of this maneuvering, which is the real Donald Trump. So the institutional checks and balances, even though his party's in control, will work. Now, that's not going to be comfort for progressives about the Supreme Court. But on national security, it's going to be an important factor.
Okay, so let's cap off.
And you wanted to ask, who's to blame?
The politics, the Democrat side, because we've got 4 years to see whether your predictions about an internal Republican check or balance works or not. I'm not as confident as you.
Depends on the issue.
Yeah, okay, but let's go to the Democrats. Who's leading the Democrats now, and who deserves most of the fury for the recriminations that will inevitably unfold now?
I don't think Harris deserves the blame. She was not a great candidate when she ran against Joe Biden and others in 2015, not at all. But given only a couple months to become the candidate for president, she ran, with one big exception, a pretty flawless campaign. Certainly a campaign that was designed to get out a ground game, to both alarm people about Trump, but reassure them that she's trying to take care of them. I don't think there's a lot tactically to blame there. The one big mistake was she was on a television show, was asked, are there any differences between you and Joe Biden? And she said, I can't think of any. That was an onside goal for sure. But I don't think in the end that's what explains her loss.
But don't you think that was symptomatic of the whole problem?
Yeah. I mean, look, she was in a real bind. She was the incumbent at a time when 2/3 of Americans wanted change. And I think she played it about as well as she could have. She looks different. She's younger. Tactically, there's nothing I could see that she could have done that would have decisively changed this. I mean, people say, well, you should have picked the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, and maybe she would have won Pennsylvania, but she needed Michigan and Wisconsin too, and in Michigan, Arab Americans were mad at her. So anyway, she's the last person I blame. Joe Biden, I'd blame a little more, and not just Joe Biden, but the democratic ecosystem and the media, because Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, media on the right were saying Biden is losing his mental faculties, he's not on the ball, and then the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN would poo-poo that as partisan. It turns out maybe it wasn't. And this soul searching is happening by Democrats who are thinking one thing that might have been a salvation for us is if we had known this a year ago so that Harris had more time, or we had an open election and got somebody really dynamic. It's one of those what if questions. But I think Biden tragically clinged on too long. And he was not elected with a mandate to be a 2-term president.
He famously promised not to be.
Yeah, so his sort of classic wrong side of the tracks, Irish stubbornness was too much, and he surrounded himself with staff who were very loyal. It wasn't like Obama or Abraham Lincoln, team of rivals. Obama had Hillary Clinton as rival as Secretary of State. Biden was like a senator, surrounding himself with staff. And so nobody had the courage to go in. And in the end, it was reportedly Nancy Pelosi who kind of had to push, and it was too late. So I think Biden deserves some blame. I don't think he's been a terrible president, mind. And on the Asia-Pacific, he's been actually quite good. The Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, are some of the biggest pieces of legislation in a long time. So he's not been a disastrous president, in my view, but I think history will judge him harsher than they judge her because of the way he and his supporters and his family and the media pretended he had what it took to run and be president again. The Democratic Party, it's hard to blame a party because nobody's really in control, but maybe the indictment is broader, and it includes, frankly, Republicans, like the guys I worked for, Bush, McCain, Romney, because the elite, and the Democrats have become more the party of the elite, has developed a bit of a smug certainty that they know what's right for the country, and they stopped listening. And they didn't listen on the border, which is a real issue. They didn't listen on inflation. Inflation's harder, but on the border, as I said, the Biden administration could have done something. And they didn't take their own constituents seriously enough. And that is an indictment broadly against the progressive elite and the country club Republicans, as you might call them, on the right. And that will take soul searching. It'll be interesting. I think there will be people like AOC and Bernie Sanders who say, well, obviously the answer is more socialism, more government spending. And others who will say, no, we need to have more business-friendly, growth-friendly policies. So it'll be a debate in the Democratic Party, and we'll see how it comes out.
You said before you see Anthony Albanese. We're recording this in your lovely office here. It's a beautiful building in Sydney. Are these the same dynamics that you see affecting a potential election loss or slide into minority government for Anthony Albanese's Labor here in Australia, or is it something different? Can you elaborate what you meant?
I think, and I've written books on Japanese politics. I've worked in U.S. politics and in the White House. I'm still an armchair. I'm an amateur on Australian
I hope
politics.
you're enjoying it.
I am. People sometimes complain Australian politics is boring. It isn't. It's interesting. Part of the reason it's interesting is because the dynamics are not all that different from the U.S. or as you'd know, living in London, the U.K. And I think this cost of living factor is the reason she lost, and it's the reason why a lot of pundits think Anthony Albanese is heading to a minority government. That's universal. The culture wars sort of refract or bounce through that. Most Americans are progressive on a lot of these social issues, but they're mad, as I said, that the government the Biden administration was emphasizing DEI or cultural or identity issues instead of issues that affect their day-to-day life. I think that progressives in Australia might have to think a little bit about that too. The voice vote here was a big surprise to them. And there's a compelling case for a voice, a pretty compelling case. But people want bread and butter issues addressed first. And so, yeah, there are those similarities. I think there are big differences, of course. The Australian economy has less of a Gini coefficient, of a gap between rich and poor, thanks to iron ore and other things. And because of compulsory voting, people who are towards the middle do better than in the US. But those are not determinative. And you can see some similar things coursing through politics here.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Okay, if you're an ally, or maybe you're just a partner of the United States and you woke up this morning, do you feel a little less comfortable, a little less secure in the world, and do you feel a bit more alone?
Depends. If you're Israel, not just Netanyahu, but Israel, you feel more secure. If you are India, you probably feel on balance a little better. Or Vietnam, countries that are less fussed about democracy and want an America that's going to be kind of tough to the big neighbor, China. If you're Germany, you're in panic. I've done surveys on this over the years. When I was in Washington at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, we did a survey in 2020. We asked foreign policy experts in 16 allied and partner countries, who's better for you, Joe Biden or Donald Trump? And this was, I think, 700 or 800 experts around the world who do think tankers, foreign policy experts. Hundreds of Europeans, not a single one picked Trump. But about half of the Indians, half of the Vietnamese, half of Taiwan, frontline states getting bullied by China. And so, and Japan and Australia were interesting. Even in the current polling before the election, 25% of Australians liked Trump, which is higher than you'd find in Europe. But even then, it depends. As you've probably seen in Italy, where you have a right-of-center government, Trump is more popular than he would be in France or Germany. So it's very mixed. I think that the Japanese and Australian governments are not worried about defense policy. Things like AUKUS are going to be fine, and in some ways might even be accelerated.
Really?
Yeah.
Explain.
People worry that Donald Trump cancels things, lies, cheats, demands more, but he can't do that to everything. And AUKUS itself has very broad bipartisan support in the Congress. And throughout this whole election year, national security officials in the Biden administration and members of Congress and national security experts in think tanks associated with Trump have been talking and have been iron plating things like the Quad, the U.S., Japan, Australia, India group, AUKUS, the alliances with Japan, with Australia, because they enjoy very broad bipartisan support and very broad public support, and because the Trump national security officials are going to be focused like a laser on competing with China. And AUKUS helps. That's the broad view. And Australia is important. So for the most part, I think defense...
Well, AUKUS helps, but it is also a drain on US industrial base, is it not?
So the opponents to AUKUS in the US Congress, and there were a few, had one objection, basically. There's not enough in the US Navy's budget for us to build the submarines we need. So they blocked it. And Congress put out a new budget, and the money's now there. And Republicans, defense spending. Will Trump? We'll see. But I think probably Trump will increase defense spending. Biden was set to probably increase by 1% the defense budget. I think there's a good chance Trump does more. And there will be fights about that, but I think historically, and we can probably expect more defense. But the other thing is, Republicans are less, there's more urgency in the Republican national security community about China. They want to be ready. They want deterrence to work. I tell people, Biden had a very good Asia policy, but one big difference between Biden and Trump on security in Asia is the Biden policy was run by academics, lawyers, and diplomats. The Trump policy was run by, and will be run again by, former military officers who have seen the war plans, who are nervous we're not doing enough. AUKUS, for people who look at contingencies in Asia, is popular because the undersea advantage is one of the big advantages the US, Australia, UK, Japan have. So I'm not worried about AUKUS. If I were in the Defense Department in Australia or in the Ministry of Defense in Japan, and especially if I were in Europe, I'd worry more about a Trump administration that has that urgency and anxiety about the balance of power with China coming in and pushing for more defense spending.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The country you didn't mention was Ukraine.
So Ukraine, I'd be nervous. And if I were Australia and Japan, I'd be a bit nervous because Donald Trump believes that he can cut a deal immediately. And his confidence comes from an inflated sense of his own negotiating prowess and a willingness to do what no other president would do, which would put the equities of NATO or Japan or Korea on the table to get a deal. And Trump did that last time. He tried to get a deal with Kim Jong-un in Korea, and he put a lot of Korean and the Pentagon and Japanese equities on the table. He was prepared to stop exercises, pull troops out. Didn't work because North Korea is not a reasonable counterpart. Ditto with China. He was going to do this big trade deal with China. It broke down. So, yes, he will push Zelensky to accept something like the current line as a border, push Putin to agree to a ceasefire and pull out. And Putin will try to get everything out of that he can.
Do you think Trump would be more open to Ukraine joining NATO because the Biden administration was very anti?
So what you hear from some foreign policy experts who are aligned with Trump is what they would do is they'd say to Zelensky, we're cutting you off unless you agree to stop at the current line for now. And to Putin, you agree to it or we'll let Ukraine join NATO. So it's sort of a classic Trump maximalist position on both sides. That's really disruptive. It will make NATO very nervous. Probably won't work. So just as Trump had big designs for China and North Korea that made allies very, very nervous, geopolitics has a way of creeping in. The rationale that people around Trump use for this approach is we need those dollars, that capability to deal with China. The America firsters are also Asia firsters. They don't love Europe, but they love Australia, they love Japan, and they really want to go at China. That logic breaks down when the leaders of Japan, Taiwan, Australia say, hold on, you caving to Putin in Ukraine hurts us in Asia because Xi Jinping in China and Kim Jong-un in North Korea will see that. And what happens to U.S. allies on one side of the world is going to be interpreted as weak U.S. support in this part of the world. So I think allies will have a big say. One of the things that will probably happen with Trump, more than it did last time, is Japan, Australia, Britain, Germany are going to do this playbook together.
Yes.
Last time there was a sort of every man for himself thing. Worked great for Australia. They got Greg Norman to get Trump to stop tariffs. I think
Joe Hockey.
Joe Hockey played a role for sure.
Who is a listener of this
podcast,
Joe Hockey, so we should give
Joe
him some
Hockey
credit.
deserves huge credit. He used the Abe Shinzo how to make friends and influence people strategy. He played a lot of golf. Absolutely, Joe deserves a lot of credit. Australia deserves a lot of credit because Americans love Australia. When Malcolm Turnbull had his disastrous first call with Donald Trump, and it was leaked by the White House, probably by somebody who wanted to put a bit of a check on the president himself, a huge number of senators, including some of Trump's closest supporters, came out and said, that's not acceptable. Australia is one of our closest friends. So Australia had a bit of an advantage.
We've seen overnight the hasty scrubbing of tweets and comments made by Kevin Rudd, a former Australian Prime Minister. Now, he is not unique. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary in the UK, has also said much more incendiary things about the tyrant in a toupee, etc., etc. Do you think these comments are going to pose a problem for Trump or them dealing with a President Trump 2.0? Or do you think that Trump is going to embrace this unifying, magnanimous vibe that he tried to strike last night?
I think Kevin will continue serving because, number one, what he said, I think he called, this was before he was ambassador, of course.
Yes.
He said in a piece in the press that Trump was, what he did was treasonous, something like that. Not as bad as what Trump's own vice president, J.D. Vance, said, which is he's a Hitler. Or Lindsey Graham, one of his closest allies in Congress, who called him a circus barker. Or Marco Rubio, who insulted his manhood. Trump collects people who crossed him and then sort of made an obvious retraction. But also, Kevin's doing a great job. I mean, Kevin is a former prime minister who would have thought that he'd get into the granular details of American export control policy and trade policy, but he has, and he's been effective. And the incoming Trump national security team is going to be very focused on China, and it's not going to want the distraction of dealing this, especially when the ambassador's doing a great job. So I think he's fine. There will be people who want to make mischief, like Nigel Farage did. There will be people in Australia who will prime people like Nigel Farage to try to get Trump mad. I don't think it'll matter. Now, it's very interesting that the ambassador scrubbed his website. I'm wondering if someone close to Trump said, hey, You'll be fine. But you might want to, don't know, but that's Trump world. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull, the former prime minister, says you can't suck up to Trump. You can't be obsequious. You have to stand up for your interests and your values. All true, but the most effective Trump whisperer was Abe Shinzo, by far. I think most people acknowledge that. I know Abe.
And Trump still talks about Abe.
He loved
to this
Abe.
day.
So Abe spent, in an hour-long summit, he spent 40 minutes talking about golf, women, sports, and then he had one or two important messages. And when Trump said something outrageous, and he frequently did to Abe, like, everyone in Asia hates you for what you did at Pearl Harbor, that kind of thing. You're ripping us off. We have trade deficits, and then we sent all those troops. Abe had he didn't say, like, Mr. President, let me explain to you how international economics works. He would say things that were very clever. I have this from people who are in the room, and I think it's right. You know, Trump once said, you're ripping us off. We have all those troops, and you've got a trade deficit with us. And Abe apparently said, you know, Donald, we've talked about it a lot, and I hear you, but, you know, there's all the trade and the defense stuff. But you know what really impresses me? That America's young men and women are willing to put their lives on the line for our alliance and for freedom. Long pause, next subject. He just was very good. And I think that's kind of what successful leaders do. Some were very good at it. Abe was excellent. I think Morrison was very good. Modi, for different reasons, was excellent. Trudeau was really bad at it because he couldn't help playing to his domestic political base.
Yeah.
Which, you know, Canadians love to sort of point out when Americans are screwed up. And he could not resist.
I think that is going to be a big temptation for a lot of left-wing the ones that are left during the Trump presidency.
It's a real risk. I think Anthony Albanese played it perfectly. He came out and he congratulated Donald Trump. He said the alliance is about more than just one person. He said he looks forward to working with him, making the alliance even stronger. And he said, very importantly, we share common values. There were a lot of people in Australia advising that if Trump wins, you can't say we have common values, which is nuts. Maybe not with Donald Trump, but with the vast majority of Americans. In our polling of the American and Australian people, very closely aligned on the importance of democracy, on the importance of alliances, on human rights and women's empowerment, actually very closely aligned in views. So of course we have common values. Donald Trump himself may not share those values. A lot of people would say he doesn't share those values with the majority of the American people. He did not get elected because of his values. 75% of the American public didn't like either candidate. 52% of Americans didn't like Trump. He did not get elected because people agree with his character or his values. He got elected because they wanted change. He was a change agent. He was decisive, if sometimes incoherent, and that's what they wanted.
But this is where I think it does matter. If something goes down with Taiwan while Trump is the president, if this was President Biden calling up Australians to say, will you help us out? Will you get involved? We might say yes. If it's President Trump, do you think the Australian public would want to say yes to helping that guy out in a conflict?
So the Trump supporters say he's better than Biden because he keeps the bad guys off guard. And nobody went to war with the U.S. when he was president. There are a lot of reasons for that, but they can make that claim. And I think there's something to it. Richard Nixon...
What, you buy this madman theory?
There's a little bit to it. I think there's, one of the problems we have with deterrence, with Putin, with Kim Jong-un, with Iran, with China, is that we are so darn reasonable. And there's a little bit to the madman theory. You want, the other side is looking to erode our security and our influence. And when I say ours, I mean not just the U.S., but U.S. allies. And they will send ships to collide with Philippine or Japanese ships. They will do cyber attacks. They'll, if the Iranians, arm the Houthis. North Korea send troops to Russia. And each time they slice that salami and we don't do anything, deterrence is weakened. And I think there is a case for, I don't know if I call it madman theory, but keep them guessing. However, that's exactly, to your point, exactly what you don't want with allies. Because if you're in a world, and we are, where you need allies more than you did before, and you need them in the fight or in the negotiation or in the technology struggle with you.
Unquestioningly, too, almost.
Yeah, I don't know about unquestioningly.
You need to assume Australia is always going to be beside
But you want them there.
Yeah.
Being unpredictable, not so good.
Yeah.
And I think this will be a big debate within the Trump administration. There will be some pretty conventional, hardline, hawkish, but conventional national security people who are saying, Mr. President, you can't go off half-cocked, threatening tariffs on our closest allies or to pull out troops. And it's not his style to be disciplined. So in a crisis, that's a concern for sure.
Because this was the last time.
I'm not saying that Australians will say Donald Trump is no damn good, so we're not going to fight.
And I'm not saying that either.
Yeah, good. The Australian government's going to have to decide in a contingency what are its interests. I worked in the Pentagon 25 years ago during the first Taiwan crisis, and that was when China had a major military exercise after the Chinese President Li Dongwei visited Cornell, and it was a bit of a shock to everyone. And the U.S. sent 2 carrier battle groups through the South China Sea with impunity. And our whole planning assumption was this will be a narrow fight in the Taiwan Strait because we have so much air and naval power. Not anymore. It's pretty clear from what the Chinese are doing that they plan to hit the U.S. and allies everywhere. They see this as a theater-wide thing. So, regardless of what Donald Trump says or does, I think the Australian government will look at what's happening and make its calculation. But it will not be helpful if it looks like the guy at the top is changing course every other day or too bellicose and then too soft. So that is a concern about Trump.
Because there is a bit of history here, particularly in the Australian context. The last time this dynamic was in real play was Iraq. And arguably that contributed to Kevin Rudd becoming the Prime Minister in 2007 because there was a lot of criticism of John Howard getting into bed with George W. Now, George W. was almost treated like a Trump figure today, and now people look back on that with a bit of nostalgia. But that...
I also remember Mark Latham going down in flames.
Well, I was just about to raise Mark Latham, and there's a reason for that too, because you see some Labor figures contemporaneously, not Mark Latham because he's left the Labor Party, but still those who are respected, Gareth Evans, Bob Carr, Paul Keating, running that same sort of anti-American strain about the national security debate and where we find ourselves now, particularly when it comes to AUKUS. So doesn't Trump and the re-election of Trump actually vindicate that particular strain of thinking?
No, not at all. Look, Bob Carr, Gareth Evans, Paul Keating, they're not running for anything again. Penny Wong, Anthony Albanese, Richard Marles are. And the Labour Party, I think, has baked into its consciousness the Mark Latham experience. Now, on the left of Labour, where there are seats where they're fighting the Greens, yeah, that's going to be different a little bit, but not for the core. And remember, as you know well, Anthony Albanese is from the left of the Labour Party. He got arrested for chaining himself to the economics department door here at the University of Sydney, demanding more courses on Marxism. And he, on his first day as Prime Minister, jetted to Tokyo for a Quad meeting and continued AUKUS. So the formers, the Gareth Evans, the Paul Keatings, the Bob Carrs, are cranky. But I don't think that defines the reality of Labour Party politics right now.
Okay, let's finish up talking a little bit about the multilaterals. So one of the hallmarks of Trump's approach to foreign policy has been bilaterals over multi or minilaterals. We have AUKUS, which you've talked about. What about the Quad? Are you confident that he will want to continue that at the same way Biden did? Because it was Biden who elevated this to leader level.
The history's a little different in my view. So the Quad began when I was in the White House in the Bush administration because of the Indian Ocean tsunami on Boxing Day 2004. And we stood up a joint task force with Japan, Australia, and India very quickly. It impressed us, and we began thinking this is a substantive grouping. That faded. Abe wanted to do it, but the Obama administration parked it, and so did Kevin Rudd, not interested. When Abe returned to power in 2012, he started suggesting we might want to bring this back, but he was very careful about it. It was the Trump administration that made the Quad what it is in many ways by creating a foreign ministers forum. And Biden continued it. And at the first, it didn't get a lot of press attention, but at the first Quad summit, Biden credited President Bush and even Trump for what they did with the Quad. Bill Hagerty, a senator from Tennessee who's very close to Trump, was ambassador to Japan, strong candidate for Secretary of State, has started a Quad caucus in Congress, bipartisan caucus, established specifically to support Biden's summit 2 months ago. So there's a lot of bipartisan continuity around the Quad. The free and open Indo-Pacific framing, allies and partners first, that was originally Abe, but then it was embraced by the Trump administration. When Biden came in, a lot of his political advisors said, you can't keep calling it the free and open Indo-Pacific because that's Trump. And then Asia advisors like Kurt Campbell said, no, it's actually Abe. And if we want to show we're serious about allies like Japan, we should keep it. And he did. So I think on Asia policy, I can tell you I'm from this world. A lot of these former Biden and former Trump officials who work on Asia are friends. They respect it. They work together. Asia policy is one of the most bipartisan areas in Washington right now. And so I think on the alliance, on the Quad, on AUKUS, you'll see a lot of continuity. Where you're going to see discontinuity is going to be climate policy,
Yes.
big time.
And that's important for the Pacific.
It is important for the Pacific. It's important for the Albanese government. And that's going to be a big disconnect, frankly. There's a lot to work on. The U.S.-Australia agreement on climate and energy includes a lot of supply chain, critical minerals work that will stay. But renewables and climate targets and the Paris Agreement and all the rest of it are in jeopardy with Trump, no doubt about it. Now,
what
there's
about
some in
China?
Australia who will welcome that, of course.
There are. And the landscape in Australia politically could look different in a couple of months.
Well, I think it's going to have a big impact on the landscape in Australia, don't you? I mean,
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I absolutely do. I think it's going to be impossible for a Labor government to argue to hold the fort on these climate agreements when our rivals and our biggest friend have pulled out, basically.
and I think you'll have new debates about nuclear.
Well, we're already having one.
Yeah, and I think it's going to pick up. When America sneezes, right, the world gets a cold.
It does. What about trade? Do you think these 10% tariffs are going to hit us?
No, I don't. I can't promise it.
But you're going to do your best to stop it, right?
Well, I can tell you this. I interned in the U.S. Trade Representative's office when I was a student under one Bob Lighthizer.
Oh.
And in those days, it was the late 80s, we were threatening massive tariffs on Japan. And Japan panicked, of course, and agreed to voluntary export restraints on autos and other products. And Bob Lighthizer and the administration were satisfied. So I think a lot of this is negotiating leverage to get managed trade, not a trade war. After Trump got elected, Wall Street had its best day in 2 years. Tax cuts, pretty certain, good for business. Deregulation, good for business. But the third element, which Wall Street Journal and others picked up on, was Goldman Sachs put out a report that influenced the market saying that they assess that if Trump wins, he's only going to do 20% tariffs on China and basically none on everyone else. That may be completely wrong, but there is a case that that's right. Because why did the public vote in Trump? The economy. What were they unhappy about? Inflation. What did tariffs cause? More inflation. So I think the politics of tariffs are not so easy.
But you're accepting that Trump will accept that logic.
Well, what happened last time was he pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and he pulled out of NAFTA, the agreement with Canada and Mexico, on day one. Or he threatened to pull out of NAFTA. He did pull out of TPP. Immediately, tariffs went up on American beef and soybean and other exports. And the farmers loved Trump, but the industry association leaders went to the Secretary of Agriculture and said, "You're killing us." What did Trump do? He went back to Japan and negotiated a bilateral agreement to get the tariffs off, went back to Canada and Mexico. So I think Goldman Sachs might have it right. We can't be sure. Can't be sure. But allies like Australia, friends like Canada are going to have to be on their game and are going to have to build coalitions, frankly. The thing about the American system of government is it's very open and accessible with all the checks and balances and the role of Congress and so forth. So Australia, Japan, Canada, the Chamber of Commerce, members of Congress from agricultural states, there's an alliance there to be built to mitigate the impact. The Treasury Department, if the Secretary of the Treasury is from Wall Street, there's a lot of factors to think about. But the American system is very complicated, and you can talk tough, but the other side gets a vote. If Trump does 60% trust on China, they'll retaliate, probably against soybean farmers and exporters, and it'll hurt. So be on guard, but don't just assume Trump is going to be able to do what he says.
Dr. Green, thanks for joining the podcast.
Yeah, really interesting. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.